Welcome people to this webinar. I'm James Michael Yeoman, I don't know what you'd call it, the introduction writer and annotator of the fantastic new publication by AK Press, which I'm showing you now, The July Revolution by Leopoldo Bonafulla, joined here by Slava, the translator of this work and really the kind of originator of the idea of doing this and putting this together. And what we're going to do today, we're joining you from 3 time zones at least at the minute. You've got AK Press over there in California, Slava's are in Chicago, and I'm joining you from Liverpool in the UK. So a truly international audience, I think appropriate for a very internationalist kind of movement and things that we're studying. So welcome all to it. I'll kick things off in a minute. We'll just allow people to kind of get settled in. I hope, you know, kind of get all your computer bits and pieces going. I'm going to have a little word at the start about why I think this work is important. And then I'm going to hand over to Slava, who's going to do a reading from the book. And then I'll come back with about 15 minutes or so discussion about the event itself, its historical context, and its kind of significance, you know, through history and to the present day. There is a Q&A function. If you're watching this on Facebook, I believe you can put comments in there and they'll get kind of passed through to us. If you're watching there on Zoom, there is a Q&A thing there at the bottom. And after we've finished with the presentation, we can field some questions there and anything you'd like to kind of talk about. And we'll just see how long that goes on for before wrapping up. So that's my sort of preamble done. I'll get into the presentation now and yeah, hope to raise some talking points for later on as well. So hello and thanks for joining us today. And I'd like to thank both AK Press for putting on this event and for the brilliant job they've done in the production of the book that we're talking about. As I'm really going to plug it here. I actually think it's a really nice edition, and they've done a really good job on that, and a nice accessible price as well. So thumbs up for them. And I'd also like to thank Slava a great deal, who, as I say, was really the main driving force behind this project from the start. And he's done a really fantastic job of translating this text, which is not an easy job by any means, because it's a complicated historical source. And really, I think this is one of the key contributions of this new publication, this edition of the July Revolution. Now, I'm going to talk about the context and the content of this work a bit later on, why it was important in its time and why it has relevance today. But to begin with, I wanted to stress how valuable I think translations of primary sources are to the accessibility and the vibrancy of history. This is something I've discussed many times with my friend and comrade, Danny Evans, another historian of the anarchist movement in Spain. Now, as many of you listening may know, the anarchist movement in Spain was undoubtedly the largest and longest lasting anarchist movement in history. And it should be a point of reference and debate beyond specialists like ourselves in Spanish and anarchist history. But in reality, it's not really. There is some discussion, but it doesn't hold anything like the place in the English language that comparable events do. I'm thinking particularly of Marxist movements and above all the Russian Revolution. And there's loads of reasons for this, and I don't want to kind of drag on and talk about all of it, but a contributing factor is the relative lack of accessible key primary and secondary material. You know, if you want to read Lenin's works in English with pretty minimal effort, you can find them all out on the internet. If you want to read what the sailors of Kronstadt were debating and declaring, you know, that's not off limits if you don't speak Russian. But comparable sources are not available for one of the other great social revolutions of the 20th century, that which erupted in Spain at the start of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. And this movement was important for 70 years before that as well. And historians of this movement, like myself, have a responsibility to do much more to promote and assist in the translation of primary materials so that new works can be done and new discussions can be had with those who do not have the same backgrounds and privileges as academics like myself. And Danny Evans, my friend who I mentioned before, has actually begun, really working on this area. And he's produced a sub-series of the podcast that we host together. It's called ABC with Danny and Jim, and his little series called ABC Bite Size, where he offers short, accessible summaries of works currently only available in Spanish. So I like to see this project in that line of trying to open up the history of the anarchist movement in Spain to a wider audience. And I think there's a nice tie-in to the historical anarchist movement here as well. The role of the translator was essential to the transnational anarchist movement in the late 19th and early 20th century, providing militants with texts and updates from across national borders, striving to undermine efforts to separate the working classes of the world and contain their internationalist ambitions. And this remains true today. Language remains a key means by which we are distinguished from one another. And so the translator, and in this case Slava, continues to do vital work in making the events, the movements, the ideas, the hopes and the fears expressed in an unfamiliar language a part of our common history. And now, on that note, I'm going to hand over to Slava, who's going to talk and give an extract from the book.
Cool. Thank you. So I'm just going to get right. I'm going to talk about the very beginning of the book and read an extract from chapter 1. So this story begins with Morocco, the colonization of Morocco. What happened was the European powers, Spain and France, decided that they were going to colonize Morocco, and they made an agreement for how they were going to split up the land. Spain was going to take the north of Morocco. France was going to get the section near Algeria, and then there was going to be a third international section. But the problem with this agreement is that nobody paid any attention to it. So all of these companies that went to Morocco to try to extract all the ore that was there, the iron ore and then the lead and whatever, they completely disregarded this agreement and started making all these side deals. So there were these sultans in Morocco as well, and they were handing out concessions, also disregarding this original agreement. Again, they were doing this to make more money. They were selling each other out as well. They were selling their own business partners out as well. So there was a lot of corruption here. Then Germany came in, and Germany was supposed to stick to the international zone, but then they invested in the Spanish zone, which went against the French interests. So there's this first article that, speaking of translation, so Bonafulla translated an article from French into Spanish, and that's the first article that's in this book. And it's a little bit confusing because it brings up all the names of these different companies and all the names of these different players. But the purpose of this article was to say that the people of Barcelona were not interested in getting involved in this conflict. This was too much corruption. This had nothing to do with them. This is just a group of business people that were trying to, make as much money as possible for themselves. They didn't care about anything else. And the sultans were helping them achieve those goals. But then in the north of Spain, the Riffian tribes or the Berber tribes resisted the Europeans. And so that's why there was this war. So the Spanish government needed people to go fight these tribesmen. Anyway, so the other problem back in Barcelona is that they were calling up reservists. So these reservists had already finished their military duty 4 years previously. And they did not want to leave again because they had literally just gotten married and they had kids now that were like 2 years old. So they did not want to leave their 2-year-old kids and go to fight in this war that they had nothing to do with, that they had no interest in. So that's how this book starts. That's the background. One thing is, though, that Bonafulla stresses numerous times, well, a few times, that they didn't, okay, so I'm going to read from this section where they go to the piers on the day that they were called up. But he stresses that they did not go to the piers for an anti-war protest. They went because they were expecting to get on the boats and go to war. But this was what happened. So a colonel of the Luchana regiment gave the order for the soldiers to disperse the crowd. It was necessary to put the troops in formation, but there was no room. The crowd invaded everything. The operation was difficult. The families did not want to let go of the reservists who they were gripping tightly in their arms. Their last moments together had come, and everyone wanted to prolong their impassioned goodbyes. The same colonel ordered a bugler to call the troops to attention. The bugler obeyed the officer, but no one moved. The soldiers were covering the edge of the pier, the only place where there was enough room to line up. A second order to call the troops to attention was given, but the bugler lacked the enthusiasm to play the notes. The people were yelling. Once the women were separated from the reservists, they began speaking in unmeasured shouts. They raised their babies over their heads so they could wave one last time to their fathers. In this moment of extraordinary commotion, some insulted the officers. Many women incited their relatives to rebellion. Throw down your rifles, resist the embarkation order, either everyone or no one, let the rich go, return home. Such were the cries coming from the tightly packed mass of people. The colonel gave the order for the third time to call attention. The shouting increases. The people ask the bugler not to play, to have compassion for the wives. They tell him about their families. The bugler hesitates and then suspends the battle song. The colonel demands that he follow the order. The soldier cannot do it and throws his instrument into the sea. Standing at attention before his superior, disciplined and upright, with resolve, he exclaims, "My colonel, shoot me if you want, I will not play." He does not rise in rebellion, but he does not obey. This sets off an indescribable uproar. The desperation, the hurt, the grief of the bugler has infected everyone. The women are shouting. They are no longer soldiers' wives, but wild animals defending their children's bread, their husbands' lives, the sanctity of their hearth and home. They hurl themselves at the rows of soldiers with more spirit than the men. The officers give the order to fix the bayonets. The soldiers obey, but they don't point them at the crowds. The screams are deafening. The order is given to open fire, but no one takes a shot and military formation is broken. Every soldier has 4 or 5 people holding them by the arm. Despite everything, they struggle through to the ships with tears in their eyes, fighting their wives, their parents, their siblings, and their fiancés to obey the command of their superiors. Sure, many rifles fell into the water. The women must undoubtedly have thrown them. A few reservists were dragged to the dinghies to be taken on board foreign ships. A French steamboat that was weighing anchor received 2 of them on board. They were walking with 5 women and 8 men, true prisoners of war. They were carried off by their own families. So I'm going to end there. So basically that was the scene. It erupted in chaos. And that, well, I want to hand it over to James after that. But that was how this whole week began, with this anti-war protest, this unplanned anti-war protest.
That's excellent. Thanks, Slava, and thanks for that really evocative extract that you've chosen there, and that really kind of sets us up nicely for where I'm going to start. I'm going to start sharing my screen just to give a sense of some images from the week that we're talking about. So hopefully you can see that there. So this here is an aerial view, well, a sort of high up view, sorry, not an aerial view, of Barcelona during the events that we're talking about. And these blazes, you can see, these are churches that are on fire. Also, potentially of interest here is the original cover publication of this work. And here is the author of it, Leopoldo Bonafulla. So it's not a fantastic image. There aren't actually that many great images from this period that are super clear and super easy to replicate online, but you get a sense perhaps of who we're talking about. So just to kind of pick up there where Slava left us on the docks of Barcelona in the midst of a protest against the deeply unpopular colonial maneuvers by the Spanish state in 1909. And that extract that he's read comes from this work, The July Revolution, an account given by anarchist publisher and educator of a popular insurrection that kind of followed on from these anti-war protests that began, it's kind of often seen as beginning on the 26th of July, 1909. And this event is most commonly now known as the Tragic Week, although at the time it was also labeled the Red Week, the Glorious Week, and in Bonafulla's case and a few other kind of anarchist commentators, the July Revolution. At its most basic level, the Tragic Week began as demonstrations against conscription of working class men that we've seen and heard about already. And this then developed into a general strike across the region of Catalonia in northeastern Spain. And Barcelona was the epicenter of this conflict as protesters clashed with security forces on the streets and then turned to destroying the property of the Catholic Church. By the end of the week, between a third and a half of Barcelona's religious buildings were burnt by protesters in what is the most spectacular eruption of anti-clerical violence in Spain for almost a century. The repression which followed this week was brutal, as hundreds of anarchists, socialists, republicans, unionists, free thinkers, they were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and exiled. Most infamously, blame was shouldered by the radical anarchist educator Francisco Ferreira, who was executed by firing squad on the 13th of October, following a trial widely regarded as a sham, both in Spain and internationally. Now, the Tragic Week has been subject to many different historical interpretations. Some have viewed it as a radical Republican project. Some have labeled it the last gasp of a pre-modern mentality in Spain, a pre-modern revolt in a backwards country. And others have labeled it a genuinely revolutionary situation. Now, I'm not going to attempt to settle over a century of historiographical debate here, and I don't really try to do that in my introduction to the book that we're talking about today. Rather, I try and situate these historical events in the words and observations of a participant in these events, Leopoldo Bonafulla, a bootmaker from Barcelona who edited several newspapers in the early 20th century that were read amongst the anarchist movement. Now, the historical value of Bonafulla's work is not really in its historical accuracy, as you might say. As Slava notes in his kind of comments on his translation, the original edition published in January 1910 was rushed. It was full of errors of fact and slippages in spelling and typography. It's also can be quite a difficult text to navigate. Bonafulla assumes a great deal of knowledge on behalf of the reader, talking about individuals, events, and themes with very little introduction. And so if you approach this work cold, like without knowing the background, it may seem a little bit unfamiliar. So that's essentially what my role has been, is to introduce and to annotate this work and try and explain it to a reader that doesn't know several of the things that you encounter. Nevertheless, this work provides something unique to anyone interested in the experience of popular unrest, the ideas and feelings of revolutionary possibilities, and the experience of state repression. It's a kind of part eyewitness account, part reconstruction from press and legal sources. And it stands as the only extended anarchist commentary or piece of writing on the Tragic Week from the time. And as such, we see how a radical publisher made sense of this event and the repression which followed, how he frames this eruption of violence as an inevitable response to the workings of capitalism, the state, and religion. How the Tragic Week to Bonafulla did not have a leader, but was rather the spontaneous impulse of what he calls unknown heroes amongst the Barcelona working class. And crucially, we see how Bonafulla thinks about how the Spanish state used the events of this week to justify a ruthless repression against the anarchist movement, which culminated in the execution of Ferreira. Now, while Bonafulla may not be able to provide us with a wholly reliable account of what happened over these days, weeks, and the months which followed, few other sources can tell us how it felt to be a part of these events and what it meant to an anarchist at the time. And I'd like to focus on three particular aspects of the tragic week and how they kind of work themselves in to Bonafuya's account in the July Revolution. The church burnings, the nature of the events themselves, and then the repression which followed. So, as I've already said, and as we heard so evocatively from Slava, the unrest began as part of a wider anti-war demonstration, which was going on all over Spain, but was particularly acute in Barcelona. Now, several groups in the city began to make plans to intensify this action, and on Thursday, the 22nd of July, a committee of anarchists, syndicalists, socialists, and Republicans called for a general strike to begin on the 26th of July, commonly seen as the start of the tragic week. After the city's economy was paralyzed and clashes began with the forces of order, protesters very quickly turned against the Catholic Church. Attacks on church property began on the first night of the tragic week as men and women gathered by a Catholic school in the industrial district of Pueblo Nuevo. They destroyed all the nearby streetlights and then they torched the building. Over the following week, dozens more burnings would follow across the city, often with little or no resistance from local residents. Similar forms of anti-clerical violence marked the first months of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, when again hundreds of religious buildings were burned across Spain. Artifacts were destroyed, and as happened during the tragic week, the bodies of nuns were dug up and paraded in streets across Republican Spain. Yet, unlike the violence at the start of the Civil War, during the tragic week, there were relatively few attacks on the persons of the clergy, on the actual people. By the end of the week, 2 monks and 1 priest had been killed, alongside 104 civilians, both protesters and onlookers, 2 civil guards, 5 members of the military, 1 policeman, and 1 security guard. And this is in stark contrast to the wave of anti-clerical violence that we see in the Spanish Civil War, in which over 4,000 priests and 2,300 monks were killed in what Mary Vincent regards as the greatest anti-clerical bloodletting Europe has ever seen. Well, clearly, it was distressing for those that valued church architecture and material possessions. I think it is the focus of violence against property, which happened during the tragic week, as opposed to people, which could lead an anarchist like Bonafuya to label the tragic week a moment of revolutionary decency. That's what he called it, a revolutionary decency conducted by brave people acting in a correct and measured manner, perhaps all too measured is how he frames it. And I have some images here as well, which I can show of this kind of anti-clerical actions, which I'm talking about here. Here is a crowd witnessing the burnings of a church property here. As I said, often this would take place with very little kind of resistance from people that live nearby. Often also not a great deal of participation. People would come out and watch the church burning. It often accompanied as well by quite an intense interest by many people to see what was happening inside the church. For many who didn't attend church, these were quite secretive, closed off spaces. And what these kind of violences against church property do is open up what was seen as secretive, cloistered spaces that they weren't welcome to. Now, a word of warning on the next image. There is not perhaps the nicest thing to see, but I also think it does reflect some of what was going on here. This is the image of 2 gentlemen leaving a religious institution, and out on the front here are the exhumed bodies of mummified corpses. So corpses will mummify in Spain. The ground is very dry. And so you do get this kind of preserved state. And often during these periods of anti-clerical violence, they would be excavated and paraded around. Okay, so that's one aspect of what I wanted to talk about there. So at midnight on Friday the 30th of July, the Church of San Juan in the district of Horta was burned and a nearby convent was ransacked. And they were the last religious buildings to be attacked. Military and civil guards poured into the city over the previous few days, and they began to disperse protesters and ensured a return to order in the city. On Monday, the 2nd of August, workers returned to factories and the tragic week was over. So how do we then think about this as a historical event? Was it, as Bonafulla claims in the title of this work, a revolution? Well, what we can be clear about, that if we think about revolutions in the manner of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, this certainly doesn't really compare to those in terms of scale or significance. It also was not directed or planned in any great detail, as we may, some models may lead us to expect. Something like the Bolshevik Revolution may want us to think that there is a clear sort of plan involved, at least ideologically. This certainly doesn't fall into that category. It was also not primarily an anarchist affair. While the movement held a strong presence in the working class of Barcelona at this time, it clearly wasn't in a position to launch or direct an event like this. But for Bonafulla, that doesn't matter in a way. If anything, the revolutionary nature of the tragic week was only enhanced by the fact that anarchists weren't there directing it. For them, a revolution could only take place if it was a spontaneous, generalized expression of outrage. That's a quote from Bonafulla himself. Direction of the revolution, as groups like Spain's socialist movement advocated, they wanted to lead and steer the revolution, was antithetical to the anarchists. It violated their interpretation of the sacred principle of the First International, that the emancipation of the working class must be conquered by the working class themselves. And many other anarchist commentators would agree with Bonafulla. Anselmo Lorenzo, the most senior figure in the movement and a veteran of the First International, was inspired by what occurred in Barcelona, precisely because it hadn't been directed by anyone. "This is amazing," he's quoted as saying. "A social revolution has broken out in Barcelona, initiated by an entity so ill-defined, ill-understood, and ill-recognized that it is sometimes vilified as a mob and other times hailed as the people. No one has instigated this revolution and no one directs it." And in the aftermath of the tragic week, anarchists were very keen to deny that there was any leader of the protests, of the strikes, of the church burnings, because it became a central part of the movement's defense against the Spanish state, who claimed that anarchists were to blame for everything that occurred. To Bonafulla, such claims were a conspiracy, a sinister plan to deny the true spontaneity of the events. It is notable, however, that anarchist commentators themselves did not use the term revolution for long after 1910, instead referring to it as the protest or the events of Barcelona. So the word does kind of drift off in their own depictions. Indeed, as I'll mention later, apart from Bonafulla's account, there is actually very little discussion of the tragic week within the anarchist movement in Spain. The tragic week itself, which instead focused almost exclusively on the repression which followed. So, as the tragic week was kind of put down and the repression began, it was clear that the blame for these events would be shouldered by the radical left. The Syndicalist Federation, Solidaridad Obrera, and its paper were closed under martial law, and high-profile anarchists and labor leaders fled the city. Those who stayed, many of those who stayed were accused of joining in or directing the rebellion. And in total, over 2,000 people were arrested in Barcelona, of whom 5 were executed, including Ramon Clemente Garcia, a young coal hauler who had unspecified mental disabilities. He was accused of dancing in the streets with a disinterred corpse of a nun, and this man was shot by firing squad. A further 59 protesters were given life sentences, and 178 were exiled from Barcelona, including Bonafulla, who began writing the July Revolution during his internal exile in rural Aragon, the neighboring province to Catalonia. This repression was by far the most lasting legacy of the tragic week, most notably and above all the prosecution and execution of the anarchist educator Francisco Ferreira. Ferreira was the personification of anarchist ambitions to educate the masses towards a revolutionary consciousness, which really began across the movement in Spain at the turn of the 20th century. Unlike the bootmaker, Bonafulla, Ferrer was from a middle-class background, and in the late 19th century, he'd been a supporter of radical republicanism. During a decade of exile in France, Ferrer was introduced to anarchist educational theory by figures such as Paul Robin, advocating free schooling, which was, in their words, attuned to the physical and mental needs of every child, without the impositions of gender segregation or the influence of church, state, or capitalism. Well, Ferrer sought to put these ideas into action, and he returned to Barcelona in 1901 and founded the modern school, the Escuela Moderna, which soon became a symbol across Europe and the Americas for advanced radical education. By 1905, around 125 students of both sexes were enrolled in the school, and they received an education which gave, and this is a quote, the positive value of education, progress, and social equality, and the negative value of the government, property, religion, the army, and bullfighting. The modern school also maintained a hugely influential publishing house, which supplied radical educators with reading primers, with textbooks and children's stories. The school faced constant pressure from authorities in Barcelona, who saw it, with good reason, as a center of sedition and anti-religious sentiments. I'll just show you a picture of Ferrer, if I can find it. Yeah. So here's Ferrer, and here is one of his many publications. This is the Boletín de la Escuela Moderna, the monthly bulletin put out by the publishing house connected with his school. You know, within there you'll find kind of advice on how to teach classes of different types, more kind of texts which could be directly used, updates from schools around Spain, Europe, and the Americas. A real kind of, it was seen as a really kind of vital part of the radical educators' subscriptions. So, the modern school was forced to close in 1906 after Ferrer was implicated in an assassination attempt on King Alfonso XIII of Spain. But he carried on his work and he remained an influential figure in Spain and Europe. He also began supporting other sort of revolutionary strategies, including the newly formed Syndicalist Federation of Catalonia, Solidaridad Obrera, which in later years would expand into the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, or the CNT, an organization which some of you may be familiar with as the large anarcho-syndicalist organization of Spain, which played such a vital role in the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 39. So, in the aftermath of the tragic week, radical educators were identified as a key factor in prompting the insurrection. Over 100 progressive schools were closed in Catalonia, as were many more in the rest of Spain. Now, within this kind of attack on radical education, Ferrer was cast as the figurehead of revolutionary ideas in Spain. He was arrested and charged by military tribunal with being the decisive influence behind the insurrection. And few contemporaries believed these charges, and the prosecution barely really tried to prove them. Instead, they set up Ferrer as being the source of seditious ideas, which was seen as equally dangerous to the social order, the fabric of Spain, as any sort of revolutionary activity itself. He was an obvious scapegoat, a recognizable figure to anarchists and the general public, whose punishment demonstrated the state's commitment to crushing radical ideas. He was declared author-in-chief of the rebellion and was shot by firing squad on the 13th of October, 1909. And if you read the July Revolution, you'll see this. Bonafulla makes a very strong case for Ferrer's innocence. And I guess in some ways he's correct. The trial was a sham. The charges were not proven, despite the verdict and so on. But as I said, really, he was on trial as being the source of seditious ideas. And I'm not going to kind of defend Ferrer for that, because he was a threat to the state. The point of contention is not whether Ferrer's activities were threatening to the Spanish state. They were, and he wanted them to be. But whether the state should have seen this as deserving of death and carried out its decision through a sham trial in order to preserve a thin veil of liberal rule of law, which barely covered the authoritarian basis of the Spanish Restoration system. This kind of broad, heavy-handed repression that we see after the tragic week followed a pattern of instinctive, brutal state violence in response to popular unrest in Spain, which had been going on for decades, often directed against the anarchist movement. And this would continue and would be seen in following years, and it culminated in the coup of General Primo de Rivera in 1923, after years of employer and anarchist violence in the streets of Barcelona. And at this point, Spain's liberal elites, including the bourgeoisie of Barcelona and Catalan nationalists, backed a quasi-fascist military dictatorship which promised order, rather than accept the demands for social reforms and dilution of their power, which came from the streets. So, apart from Bonafulla's account, there was very little anarchist reaction to the tragic week itself. Few anarchist newspapers examined the events in any depth, and all refused to discuss anarchist participation in these events. Instead, they focused almost exclusively on the execution of Ferrer. Contributors saw Ferrer as part of a lineage of radical thinkers who had suffered at the hands of the Catholic Church. People like Jan Hus, Galileo Galilei, and Michael Servetus. Ferrer's treatment was also explicitly linked to the experience of Christ, including in one quite remarkable postcard entitled Ecce Homo, Behold the Man. Okay. These are the words used by Pontius Pilate when he presented Jesus Christ to the crowds of Jerusalem. Okay. This postcard, which I'll put up on screen in a sec, it displays Ferrer's bloody head over a shroud surrounded by a crown of thorns. So it couldn't really be clearer, this analogy to Christ that is being made. So let's pull that up and show. Whoop, you don't, sorry, don't mean to share that, that's my emails. Right, where's it gone? There we go. There we go. Yeah, so this postcard here, Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, and here is Ferrer's head with replete with bullet holes from his execution by Florence, but here is a crown of thorns, the date of his execution. So clearly being framed here as a martyr to the cause of revolutionary ideas. And this carries on in following decades and right up to the present day. This is a really beautiful piece of work by the anarchist artist, Flavio Constantini, which was made in the 1970s. And you know, this image of Ferrer the martyr continues, you know, holds a very strong presence. And it's a contentious one. Even at the time, you know, a number of anarchists would say this is a kind of Christianization of Ferrer. We shouldn't really be doing this, but clearly there was an impulse to do it, was to make this figure into a symbol for what they stood for. Ferrer's trial and execution also sparked an international campaign of protests against the Spanish state. While he was on trial, huge meetings were held across Europe and the Americas calling for his release, including one in Liverpool, where I am today, which Ferreira had visited Liverpool and inspired the anarchist educational school in 1908. And these protests intensified after his execution, resulting in serious disturbances in Paris and Rome. He also was kind of then really kind of ingrained as the world's foremost image of radical education. In the Netherlands, you could buy postcards of his portrait and children's books about his life from anarchist publishers. Plays based on his life and execution became a feature of socialist clubs from Mexico to Beirut. And really kind of most notably, his kind of legacy was cemented by the many dozens of modern schools which emerged in almost every continent following his execution. This was particularly pronounced in the USA, where a long-lasting modern school movement emerged from 1908 onwards, supported by the Francisco Ferrer Association, which included novelists such as Jack London and Upton Sinclair amongst its members. But to finish, I'll just call back to the words of Bonafulla himself. In the final paragraph of the July Revolution, Bonafulla asks a poignant question. Was this sacrifice productive? And his response, I think, is fitting, acknowledging that although, quote, not as much as we would have hoped had been achieved. The path to social change, to revolution, and to a better world, to, in his words, the overcoming flood of new ideas, had nevertheless been opened by the activists, the educators, and the ordinary people of Spain, to whom he had written his account. And that's where I'll end my talk there. Nice and smoothly, I'm now going to take on some questions, if there are any in the box there. Ooh, I don't have any written here. Slava, can you see any questions in the Q&A? I think you're on mute.
No, I don't.
Yeah, that's fine. No questions in there. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, we covered all bases in our between.
You know, I wanted to say though about this thing about turning Ferreira into this Christ figure. The other thing I was actually thinking, I'm not going to read it now, but I was thinking I would read also one of the scenes in this book is the execution of Ferreira at the end, when he's, it goes into, I think that they got this information. He spent 6 hours speaking to the notary, and then his defense lawyer came and he spoke to his defense lawyer, and then there's a scene of him, you know, getting shot in the head with the 3 shots in the head, plus he got shot in the throat. But one of the things in that chapter was it talked about his will, where, you know, what he had a very long will, all the things he wanted to do with his money. And anyway, one of the things he said in his will is that I think he basically said he did not want people to turn him into a Christ figure. And I mean, I'll just read one paragraph from his will here, where he says, "I also hope my friends will not talk about me too much or too little, since that is how we come to create idols, which later becomes an obstacle to progress. One's ideas are taken to be intangible precepts, and this is unfortunate for the future. Man's ideas should be debated, and before applying them, they must be studied to see whether they're good or bad." So, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting point. But I think we do have questions now. Oh, Amy asks, what connections do you see in the description of the anarchist revolution as one coming spontaneously from the people in more recent events, like the Arab Spring?
Take that first, Slava?
No, you go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fine. So what connections in the description of this one? I think there are parallels to be made. And now I'm treading carefully because I'm not in any way an expert on the Arab Spring. But it is a parallel that I've drawn sometimes in my work, particularly in the kind of the nature of horizontal kind of organizing and in the ways that media plays a role in linking groups together. And I know that there has been some good work on the kind of role of social media during the Arab Spring. Now, the point that I've made in my work is that whilst it's a lot slower, anarchist publishing networks did perform a similar sort of task. This was a very open style of media with lots of kind of fluid debate and back and forth. It wasn't a kind of singular party line sort of style of organizing. And in Spain, we're talking about hundreds of periodicals at any given moment. So that's the parallels that I'm kind of familiar with. In terms of the spontaneity, it's always an interesting question about whether we should describe something as spontaneous or not. I think often when people think of that term, they mean it's come totally out of the blue, or that it can't be expected. And there's some really excellent work done on the early days of the Spanish Revolution in Barcelona in 1936, which is often seen as spontaneous or has been framed in that way. Whereas actually what happened there was a reflection of many years of local organizing at a level that people basically don't often consider as historians. This excellent work by Augustin Yeoman, also used by Danny Evans, which looks at defense committees, local committees that made those areas ready to act in what was seen as a spontaneous way. The difference, I think, with the Tragic League is that that sort of infrastructure did not actually exist prior to then. So we can talk about spontaneity in some ways. And again, it depends what you mean in that way, because I don't see protests against conscription for a deeply unpopular colonial maneuver by the Spanish state as being spontaneous, if we mean it's kind of come out of the blue. I see that as a fairly predictable reaction by the working classes who've been treated appallingly in that city. So perhaps spontaneous isn't really the right word in that context. I will hesitate to say anything more about the Arab Spring because I'm wary of talking beyond my specialty.
Maybe bona fide, not spontaneous, but not led by anybody. You know what I mean? I don't know. But I see your point.
There's also, I mean, there is a trickiness in that, as I kind of tried to hint at there, anarchists in the past, you know, were very keen to disavow that anyone was in charge, and were very keen to highlight spontaneity because that fitted with how they thought revolutions would happen. So there, and I'm wary of necessarily taking their word for it all the time in that way, because as I said, where they're seeing spontaneity and they're seeing kind of almost inevitability of revolution that will, in a sense, just happen. And this is in a period prior to, for example, the CNT being organized. And there was a belief and a reliance on an idea that the people, when pushed hard enough, will just react in that way. And I think that that's, you know, that isn't always necessarily how it played out.
I want to, okay, we have 2 more questions, but real quick, I want to say something about this translation. I got the feeling, okay, it's also about this issue of spontaneity. The thing is, I got the feeling when I was translating this, I spent a lot of time, I mean, they say translators are, you know, best readers because you spend a lot of time with every single sentence. But I really got the feeling when I translated this, that part of the purpose of this book was to defend Ferreira at the end. And so a lot of these things he was saying in the beginning are, in a way, they're almost, you could look at it as like a direct response to what the lawyer was saying during Ferreira's trial. Like what he was saying about Ferreira is like in the first chapter, it's almost like he's directly responding to that. You could look at it that way. And so part of why he keeps on saying this thing about it, how it was spontaneous, is because that's exactly what the opposite of what the lawyer was saying. The lawyer, you know, the prosecuting attorney, kept saying that Ferreira directed the whole thing, which was ludicrous. Like, there's no way that he could have directed this entire thing. Like, even if he participated, he could not have been the mastermind behind this entire thing. And that's what they were saying in court. So I really got the feeling this entire book, this entire thing about this was totally spontaneous. This was, nobody led this. It's in direct response. But anyway, but yeah, let's go.
I think that's an excellent point. In a sense, it's easy to get drawn into that particular debate about responsibility. So when I say, you know, I don't necessarily think that these things are spontaneous as if completely sui generis, like with no one, you know, orchestrating them. I don't believe that, because I don't think that's how things work. That doesn't mean I think that there was one mastermind pulling the strings behind the whole things and that person was Ferreira. That's right. What I mean when I say I don't think Ferreira should be defended on the grounds that he was completely innocent desiring social revolution, which is kind of where Bonafide ends up, because I don't think that's true. I think he did one. Now, he obviously couldn't have done that by himself in Barcelona. Right, and so, you know, you don't have to necessarily fall so hard on the idea of, you know, direct authorship or completely out of the blue spontaneity, I guess.
So we have 2 more questions. I'm not sure if I definitely can't answer the question by Marpo. Maybe you can, James. What are the current anarchist organizations operating in Spain at this time? I did see CNT offices still existent in Cordoba 20 years ago, but mostly just a bunch of old guys hanging out. Do you have any idea?
Well, the CNT does, it does still exist, and it's still, you know, it has a presence, as does a kind of, how would you call it? There was a split in the 70s after the kind of the transition to democracy, as it's called, and so there is also the CGT in Spain as well. So there are, and they're strong in, well, stronger in Barcelona, I think, than other areas, and also strong in certain trades. So I believe it's the metro workers of Barcelona are kind of, their branch is particularly strong, and they can, you know, they can call particular strikes. I guess from a historian's point of view, it, you know, it's really not the same thing, I guess, that we're talking about as the early 20th century. You know, when, you know, in 1919, when you're looking at, you know, some of the high points of CNT membership, they would claim almost 1 million members in a country of 20 million. And basically you can't, there is nothing that, you know, compares to that now in Spain. What there also is as well is less those kind of large identifiable organizations like the CNT. I mean, that exists, like I say, but there is also, you know, there is a vibrancy, there is an anarchist culture in many towns. You'll find, you know, perhaps not as easy as pinpointing the CNT offices, but you know, it's there in a way that I basically think doesn't exist in many other places, and I think that is a result of the depth and the longevity of the movement in Spain, which you know, really did go beyond many other countries. Other countries have had large anarchist movements, and they've had important anarchist movements. None of what I'm saying is meant to downplay that, but I think that combination of longevity and scale of the movement in Spain makes it stand out, and means that it's been hard, really, to ever go away.
So, and then Amy Blondell also asks, she asked me, where did I struggle most in my translation and why? You know, this was, so my first translation, the thing is, this was written in 1909, and it's a more difficult text than a modern text. I was really amazed, like, as I was doing this, because, you know, I mean, I knew that Bonafulla was a shoemaker. He was a working class guy, and there was a lot of illiteracy in Spain. So I really wondered, how is someone who lives in a society where more than half the people are illiterate, and he's a shoemaker, how does he write sentences like this? Because these are some very long, intricate sentences. It's pretty incredible. In some cases, there were sentences that were so long in this, it would take me like half a day to get through half of one sentence, because it's hard to, like, sometimes. And then also something that they did back then with their sentences, they didn't, like, sometimes you could split up a thought, like the beginning of the thought would be at the beginning of the sentence, and then there'd be all this stuff in between, and then the thought doesn't end until way later. And so it takes a long time to figure out, like, what is the connection between these words. And but it's funny because and then after I translated it, I then went and reread it in Spanish, and it's so interesting because then after I knew what he was saying in each of these sentences, it was a totally different experience of reading it. And then I could see how a working class person could write like this, because it's just like, it's interesting because it's a very difficult thought process for a modern ear, I guess. Yeah.
Did you find that, you know, through the process of translating, that it got easier as you went along, and as you started to kind of fall into Bonafulla's way of writing?
Not really. The thing is, there are certain places where he uses very short sentences. Like the thing that I read today, those are very short sentences. So any place in this book where there was, you know, really, it was about action rather than his thought process, there are shorter sentences. So that was easy. Anything like that was easy. But yeah, I don't know. I think now if I redid this now, or if I translated something else for him now, it would be easier. But yeah, it was pretty grueling.
It is, yeah. I mean, I can speak from my own experience of reading, hundreds of anarchist papers from this period as well, and it is a slog. And it goes without saying, and it's not a criticism. Like you said, a lot of these people are working class. A lot of them are self-taught. They're not always the best writers. It can be a drag, and part of what I was going to mention before about translation. I didn't really have a strong background in Spanish before I started my PhD, and I basically learned Spanish, to the level I have it now through reading, turn of the century anarchist periodicals. So I have a very strange vocabulary in Spanish. I can say some pretty obscure things, but also like quite a lot of normal things go over my head. And that's why I want to make my very, very few people are privileged enough to be able to spend a year or two of their life getting up to speed in Spanish through reading the historical sources. I know that isn't a normal experience for people. And so that's why I try and write in a way that's accessible. And that's why I think things like translations are really important, because if we want people, other than ourselves, talking within ourselves to be able to get hold of this stuff, that's not, I don't advise doing what I did, to get there. One thing I found, was with time, you start to recognize, they copy one another quite a lot. It starts to get recognized, that kind of thing. So I think you, for example, Slava, could go and read other texts from this period, and you'd start, you'd recognize patterns of writing and vocabulary and things.
Probably, yeah. No, well, I quickly looked at something by Anselmo Lorenzo, but he seemed easier to understand. But
he's
anyway,
better. He's a better writer.
Maybe.
As is Ferreira, actually. You can read Ferreira.
Oh yeah,
good writer as well.
So okay, let's go to real quick. Amy has the second part of her question. What about the independence movement in Barcelona and Catalonia today, and the role of historical memory? So the relationship between the independence movement today and back then. It's not. Well, I could answer this really basically. If you want to do a more in-depth. I mean, the basic thing is that the independence movement, the Catalonian independence movement back then was not a leftist movement. It was a movement. The people who were behind it, which they have, their things. They have some statements in here, but the people that were behind it were the super wealthy. So there was this. Well, there were different groups. They had their own thing called Solidaridad Catalana, which was based on Solidaridad Obrera, but like one of the main groups in. So that was a coalition of groups that were for independence. But one of the main groups in that was like the top capitalists of Barcelona, like they called it the Regionalist League or something. So those were like the owners of all of the factories. They were part of that movement. And then there were other groups there were all kinds of groups, like there were Republican, I guess there were Republican independent things, but basically it was not a leftist movement. And then it somehow became a leftist movement today. So would you say that's about right?
I would say that's absolutely right for that period. It wasn't, anarchists at that point regarded Catalan nationalism as, I guess, what it is, which is a nationalism and something that they wanted to avoid. They wanted to avoid kind of separatism and the drawing of new lines where there should be no lines, I guess. The Catalan language wasn't really, probably almost certainly spoken by many anarchists in Barcelona, but they certainly didn't write it. I think of the hundreds of publications that came out of that city, 2 in the period I'm familiar with were published in Catalan, and the rest were in Castilian Spanish. Many anarchists actually were quite forefront in efforts to popularize Esperanto, as a universal language, because they saw again, as I said earlier, language as a barrier to be overcome in some ways, not again as something that you put in. Now, obviously, that that kind of ideological background is also tied with, as you said, the fact that the class background of Catalan separatism at this point was very much of the upper middle and upper class, and it wasn't really seen as something for workers. This changed in the 1930s, and it did become a kind of centre-left Catalan nationalism became the prime expression of it, which was then brutally repressed by Franco, under the Franco dictatorship. And so there is, there's a whole other trajectory there. And to be honest, it's not one that I'm, again, a specialist in, and I wouldn't want to kind of comment on it. Like I said, where I am clear is that those, as you said, those two lines are very separate at the time that we're talking about here in 1909. My own feelings, are about the current situation, basically vacillate. They go backwards and forwards. Once again, the Spanish state has proven itself to be very ready to be quite brutally violent. And whatever you think of the cause of Catalan nationalism, the sites that we saw in recent years about what's going on there, you can only say that this is appalling. Once again, though, basically there isn't one Catalan independence, kind of position. There are middle class Catalan separatists, there are working class ones, and I think they want very different things. And so, it's quite hard to come down either side. In some ways, I don't think it's really my position to have,
etc. And then the next question is, does the text mention if there was any connection to the Basque movement at the time? I would say there is no mention of the Basque movement at the time, not in this book.
Right, and I would agree on that. Not really in the movement at all. It's not. It doesn't.
Yeah.
Really to some extent,
it does talk about the.
There you go.
It basically only talks about Catalonia as well as towns outside of Barcelona, but in Catalonia, and then the neighboring. What is the neighboring region? There's other towns nearby, smaller places, but not. We don't go all the way to the Basque country.
No, yeah, and I would say as well, yeah, just generally, it doesn't really feature within the anarchist movement in this period. No, similar considerations as to the Catalan nationalists. It's seen as a product of the bourgeoisie in the Basque region. It's seen as something which distinguishes rather than kind of unites. And also it's seen as a kind of almost like a folkish, sort of thing, particularly more so with the Basque example. Again, this does change. This changes in the 1930s. There is a different expression of Basque nationalism, which remains, still that of a more centrish, centre-right kind of expression. And both of these, really, in a sense, I would think both of these kind of nationalisms that people are familiar with, the Basque, Catalan, really are totally transformed by the experience of Francoism and the brutal repression that comes in there from the end of the Spanish Civil War up until the 1970s. The absolute repression of the languages, the attempt to eradicate and kind of unify Spain under Castile. And I see the modern movements really as, that is their antecedent much more than this kind of early 20th century period when I think they're both quite different to how we think of them today.
Yeah, so it does not even, so Marpo said Valencia, but no, it was not even, we're not even going that far. I was thinking of Girona, which is closer. It's like neighboring, like directly abutting Catalonia.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think that was a time that things happened much more locally. I mean, it was a lot harder, and also even during this week, right? You could talk about this maybe. That they cut down all the telegraph lines, so there was no communication. So it was very difficult to communicate. So they did talk about how they had workers that went to all these neighboring towns to tell them about the general strike. But beyond that, it was very difficult to communicate. And anyway, maybe that speaks to why it was so amazing that there were worldwide protests when Ferreira died, considering that they were communicating by telegraph, and maybe a little bit by telephone.
Yeah, and very quick as well. They were very quick off the mark. In fact, it was the international reaction that came first, ahead of the Spanish reaction to Ferreira's trial and execution. Partly because there was martial law in many areas of Spain following the tragic week, so repression would have followed any sort of mass gathering. But also, had this kind of international presence, status. He was seen as a kind of citizen of the world by many people on the left, to the extent that quite a few anarchists in Spain, felt that his memory was being kind of whitewashed or, tidied up for a sort of international liberal bourgeoisie kind of. They like the idea of kind of forward-thinking education, but they don't quite like the anarchist stuff, and they don't quite like the syndicalism stuff. They say, why are they building statues to Ferreira in Belgium, which they did. Why aren't they setting up a school? Which kind of goes back to your point earlier. So yeah, no, the geography of the book is interesting because it is quite localized, and then you also follow some of the exiles out into their internal exile, which was a very common punishment in Spain at the time. You'd be told that you couldn't go to a particular area, so a lot of them end up in kind of rural villages in Aragon, which kind of neighbors Catalonia. That's where Bonafulla is when he starts putting the book together. And that's interesting, not least because I find some of those comments quite patronizing from the reports that they give back. They call the peasants, simple folk who welcome them, kind of graciously, or in some cases, they're kind of rude, ignorant peasants, and that doesn't really strike me as particularly kind of solidarity thinking. If as soon as you leave the city, you're kind of denigrating the people that you meet. But again, a reflection.
It's true. There was one point. And so what happened was you wrote that introduction, and then I read it, and you wrote about how he was patronizing because he called people simple folk, which that is patronizing. Then I went back and looked, and I got paranoid. Like, what if that was like not what he really said? But he really did. It really sounded like simple folk, like that. He would. This author was. Bonafulla was exiled to wherever he was exiled, but he called the people of the town where he was exiled, he called them simple folk. But
again, it's a reflection of the time, and a reflection again of the way that many kind of anarchists thought about people, that there is a beautiful kind of innocence to people untouched by the corruptions of capitalism and so on, and that that kind of natural, instinctive, simple way of life is something to be cherished. Now, even though it's a positive framing, it is patronizing, and I don't think there's any getting away from that.
Should we answer this one last question from Amy, or do you want to end it? She says, when Andre and I did architectural tours of Barcelona, including hospitals and churches, no mention was made of the destruction of churches or anti-clerical activity in Barcelona history. We did notice that the churches we saw were not that old. How is this history being kept alive in Barcelona today?
The radical history of Barcelona, I would guess, you know, there are lots of kind of local historical groups. There's an excellent, actually, if anyone's in Barcelona, Nick Lloyd is a guy who does really excellent walking tours of Barcelona, where, you know, I would recommend that to anyone. He does some on the Civil War, and you can go to many of the places there, places visited by, say, George Orwell, or where, you know, some of the repression happened there during the Civil War. They're really good, and he does have a turn of the century tour as well, so you may get a different scene. I know that he takes people to the Liceo Theatre in Barcelona, which is where an anarchist very famously threw a bomb from the gallery into the main stalls there in 1894, I think. So I'd be surprised if he didn't cover the church burnings as well. But you know, I think it's there. You know, as ever, the turn of the century movement, the turn of the century period in Spanish history is, for very good reasons, but it's far less covered by interest, I guess, particularly in English, but also in Spanish history. You know, it's just not as much of a draw as the 1930s, the Civil War, and also now the Franco period. You know, that's really where people, you know, want to go, and there's obvious reasons why. But you know, if you look under the surface, there is a bit more of that kind of us 19th, early 20th century historians still plugging away at that.
I think they're also, you know, part of it is forget. They wanted to, for part of the policy of the state was to forget about the past. Like that's sort of like, isn't that? I mean, I heard this elsewhere that, you know, a lot of people in Spain don't know about the history. So many aspects of history, you know, even though this is studied worldwide by anarchists, like the anarchists are all looking towards Spain, but even a lot of Spanish people don't know about this history because their policy of actually forgetting about all of it, the fascism and everything that happened. I wish I knew I wish I had the name of this policy of forgetting. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Mm. Yeah, no, yeah, the kind of official, you know, agreement over the transition to democracy to not kind of basically not to prosecute or bring up, you know, crimes of the past. I'm kind of skeptical about how real it is that people forgot. You know, I don't think that, you know, I think people sort of talked about it. There's still a very long legacy and memory of those years. I don't think it's nothing. Well, there isn't, or hasn't been a lot of, is, you know, official recognition of what went on under Franco. So yeah, it's a complicated and, you know, perhaps slightly moving out of our sort of area to get into that debate, but it's still a very live one, and you know, one that we can, I don't know. I'm always kind of wary. I'm wary of saying that one country has a particularly bad relationship with its past, you know, because I'm sat here in the UK, and I think if I asked many people around the UK, you know, what's our relationship with Ireland been like the past 300 years, I don't think many people could tell you a single thing. And
yeah,
and
so you
every
guys would do better than the US. You guys, I was saying, I think you guys would still do better than the US for our history. But anyway.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't necessarily, you know, and there are really obvious things that you can point to with, you know, there's very little national monuments, museums, curriculum. Clearly, yes, there are issues there that remain, you know, unsettled. At the same time, I'd say Britain maybe even has a settled history, and it's one that covers up an awful lot that should be under discussion. So, you know, I'm wary of pointing a particular thing. I think might move to wrap up there because I not at least from my own point of view, because
Well, it's after midnight for you.
Midnight, and
Yeah.
it is. But it's been great, and thank you for the quite lively discussion there in the comments. I've enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed the opportunity of talking to you this evening, afternoon, wherever you may be. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Slava, for all his work on this book as well. I've been told again, you can buy the book now. It's a lovely edition. It's very affordable at the minute. It's on offer quite well, so do check it out. Like I said, I think it's important that those of us with an interest in radical history go back to those primary sources. And I think as Slava's really lovely extract kind of gave, it's a really evocative and useful thing to read. So any words from yourself?
Well, no, just thank you. Also, I really appreciate, having a really rigorous explanation of all these things that are going on. So thanks for this talk too. So, and thanks for the questions for everybody.